Hello and welcome to lesson number 5. I'm Jack Gately, owner of Jack Gately Real Estate and the Real Estate School as well. Lesson number 5 is all about value. All about value. Now, value is so important. After all, people are going to be asking you constantly, hey, what's the value of my house? You're going to, or property, I should probably say, what's the value of the real estate? You're going to be going to listing appointments. And one of the important dynamics in any particular listing appointment is going to be, hey, what should we list the property for in order to actually achieve a certain sales price? So that's a discussion which is basically centers all around value. All around value. How much is it going to be? How much is it going to be worth? And that's what lots of folks want to know from you is, hey, show me the money, right? Well, what's this gonna be worth? What can I get for it? That's an important and critical part of your job as a real estate professional. And you should know the basic underlying economic concepts relative to value, that shape value, form value, and also to understand how appraisers, a professional that is involved in almost every real estate transaction when there's a lender involved, how do they look at value? And they might look at it a little bit different than real estate agents do. So you got to have a pretty good concept of value, right? That makes sense going into this. Hey, what are things going to cost? So when we look at value, there's two basic concepts that we need to separate. They sound a lot alike, and the first one is called market value. Market value. All right, and we need to compare that with market price. Market price. Now, market price is kind of the easier one. So let's take that one first. It's what someone actually paid, for the property. So that's pretty easy. Market value has a little bit longer definition of it. So let's quote directly from Housing and Urban Development, HUD, Housing and Urban Development, and they're going to define market value for us. So let me read that sentence to you. Quote, the most probable price which a property should bring in a competitive and open market under all conditions, requisite to a fair sale, the buyer and seller each acting prudently, knowledgeably, and assuming the price is not affected by undue stimulus, end quote. In other words, for a lot of people, we call this, part of this definition includes, is it an arm's length transaction? Arm's length transaction. And basically, arm's length transaction means that are two parties negotiating a price in the most purest of markets, not what was the word I'm looking for? Not super fueled by some type of undue stimulus, as they say. So not some type of unusual loan program that is going to inflate the price, for instance. And they're separate. They're unknowing. They're unknown to each other. They're not cousins or something like that. They're acting in their own, how would we say, enlightened self-interest. So that's market value. Now that's where we put as a real estate agent, you're going to be looking at market value and market price. And again, of course, sellers are just going to, hey, what am I going to get for my house? Stop with this market value jive. What's the difference really? Well, you need to know for the exam that market value is the purest value, and hopefully it will be pretty close to market price, but theoretically, from a theoretical point of view, market value is going to be that theoretical price. Yeah, in theory, I guess is a good way to add that definition over here. In theory, this is what you should get. and market price is actually what you get. And hopefully they're pretty close to equal, but they're not always going to be equal. So that's the difference between market value and market price. So when we look at value itself, value is affected, of course, by our good old friends, supply and demand. Supply and demand, some of you might remember those. And when we look at value, of course, we're looking at value. Don't have a lot of space to squeeze up there, but that's our overall topic on this slide here. Value is affected by supply and demand. And one of the when you dig around and you think about supply and demand, the first thing you think about is whether or not the real estate has any utility. How could it be used? Is it have some value in the usefulness of the property? Is there maybe it's an upstate Maine or down east Maine, and so it's a great foresting location, or maybe it's a great place to put a dock in a little boat yard, and so all these types of things affect its utility, how useful it could be. And then going along with our good old friend supply and demand is scarcity. If there's plenty of properties that could be used to put in a dock in a boatyard, then that's going to what? If there's a lot of them, that's going to be able to drive down the price because there's not that much supply. Okay, so this is a question of supply. And demand is on the other side of that, of course. Demand, we'll squeeze that in here, and that's the number of people who actually want the property, And then there's another aspect to that too, because there might be a lot of people who want the property, but there might only be a few people who can actually afford the property. So that's actually called, and we're running out of space here, but you know what, I'm going to just write it down here. You can see it. Effective demand. So you have demand. Hey, I want to live on Park Avenue. A lot of people do, but there's only so many people who can actually afford it. And so that's effective demand. And that's going to have an aspect where we have, obviously, if you remember all these charts from economics, if you took economics, you're going to have supply and demand, and wherever they meet is going to be hopefully the price. There we go. All right, so the next aspect that we have on this list here, and I'm going to just squeeze it in up actually over here, if you don't mind, on one of these four value aspects, characteristics of value, is transferability. Can you transfer the property? And so if you have a property that has, say, like we talked about in lesson number 2, and if you haven't taken lesson number 2, this will make sense when you do, but if you have a property that is difficult to transfer because it has a lot of clouds on the title, and it would be more valuable, for instance, if you had went through the process and got it registered through the land court, there would be a good aspect. Obviously, you can sell almost anything, but if there are a number of clouds on the title that is going to then that means that, by the way, for those people who haven't taken lesson 2, it means that there's some type of lien against the property in the most cases. Somebody is claiming a portion of the ownership. So if it's tough to transfer, that's going to decrease your value, obviously. So these are the 4 characteristics of value, and since we've made quite a bit of a mess on this page, haven't we? I'm just going to kind of number them for you right now so that you can see them. 1 is utility, 2 is scarcity, 3 is demand, and 4 is transferability. So again, we'll just mention this again. How can the property be used? How useful is it? How many others are there like it? Are there other people out there looking for such a same property? And how many actually can afford it? That's this one here. And the last one is how able is the seller to actually sell it? Or is there some way that the seller has some type of claim against it that's going to slow the seller's ability to transfer the property? For instance, a short sale where the seller owes more than it's worth, that would be something that would affect its transferability. So very important concepts that we have to learn there about value. We're going to go and talk about some additional concepts about value right now. And before we do that, I just want to mention real quickly, this is an important aspect of value characteristics, is that in order to have a value, especially a monetary value, a piece of property must have at least some aspect of all four of these items. So it's got to be it's got to have some type of utility. It's got to have some scarcity to it, some demand, and some transferability to it. It's got to have at least a sliver of characteristic of each. I once had a listing that it was a postage stamp piece of land, not very big at all, not much more than you could park, say, like 3 or 4 cars onto, and it was in a subdivision, so it was not very valuable because you couldn't build a house on it. It was in a residential subdivision. But it had, I guess it could have some utility. You could park some cars there. You could cut the wood down and harvest the wood, I guess. You could park your boat there or something. So it had a modest utility. Scarcity, there was not a lot of these little lots around. So yeah, it was scarce, I guess you could say that. The property owner owned it outright. There were no liens on it, so it was definitely transferable. The problem is that nobody wanted it. And nobody wanted it. And so it actually didn't have any value because there was no demand. So in a case where there is absolutely no demand because nobody, we'll just cross this person out, you're going to drive on the boat, nobody wanted it. Therefore, it had no value. And in fact, in the end, I recommended to my client to actually gift the land to the town because nobody was going to buy it. And I figured that I told my clients, hey, why don't you gift this to the town as a dedication? And she went forward and I think she took my advice and donated it to the town. I connected her with an attorney to do so. So you gotta, in order to have some type of monetary value, you have to have at least some component of all four of those items before you actually can realize a monetary gain from selling the property. So we were talking about value, and we just talked about at length, we talked about market value and market price, but there are other types of value. There's different ways to look at value, and one of the most common ways, we're going to actually talk about several of them right now, one of the most common ways that you hear all the time is assessed value. Assessed value. Now, I get this all the time. Assessed value versus appraised value, which is just a little bit farther down the page here. There's a big difference between one and the other. For assessed value, it's basically what your local municipality is putting a price tag on your home so they can figure out your tax bill. And here in Massachusetts, it's very common that this be a lagging indicator. It lags behind the assessed value versus market value. It's not uncommon, for instance, if you're buying a house for the market price is $380, it's not uncommon that the assessed value might be like $320. Now, in other states, not necessarily in any particular state, and there are many states that the assessed value is pegged to the market value and or the market price. But in Massachusetts, it's not. It's a lagging indicator. So it's not uncommon if you're working with a out-of-state buyer, they say, well, the assessed value is $320. Why am I paying $380? Well, in Massachusetts, these things tend to lag behind. So it's the value that the town puts on the property, and very often it's divorced from the actual price that someone's willing to pay for it. Now, the next one is going to be loan value. This is the value that kind of speaks for itself. This one's pretty easy, folks. Sometimes referred, by the way, as mortgage value. Mortgage value. This is obviously the amount that the bank is willing to lend. There's an easy one. Okay, so the bank looks at it a little bit differently in terms of risk, and they're going to be looking at something called LTV, which we're going to get into in the math section of the book. Loan to value, they're going to be looking at that. So we'll talk more about LTV later, but obviously there's a loan value. It's the amount that the lender would be willing to lend on the property. Appraised value. So this one is the one that's attempting to be as close as possible to the market value. This is an attempt by a licensed appraiser, a professional in the field, to reach market value. They're doing their best to reach market value. I would just make a quick cautionary kind of opinion here. So you should know that of the appraisers that you come across, the average age of the appraiser is in Massachusetts. Someone just recently told me, I don't have a statistic to back this up, but they told me that the average age of the appraiser in Massachusetts is 58 years old. I got that from an attorney, from a real estate broker, and he's 20 years in the business, so I kind of have a tendency, that does back up my personal experience in meeting appraisers, that they do tend to be in their 50s, plus or minus. But why I say that is that you should be mindful that even though you're only seeing the appraisers for a short 35, 40 minutes, an hour at the most of these professionals have been at this valuation game for a very, very long time. And for the most part, they have many, many, many more years of experience than your average real estate professional. So just food for thought for you to think about. Okay, so investment value. It's the value attributed to the use of property over a certain time period. So that's a question I always ask my clients. They're going to ask you, hey, is this a good value at this price? And then I always respond to that with the question of whether or not what their plan is for the property. So I always ask, hey, is this a good value? What should I be buying? Well, it all depends upon your plan, how patient you are, how much time you have. That's the question I always say. Hey, do you want to flip it in 2 or 3 years, or are you in this for 20 to 30 years? And the answer of whether or not it's a good investment or a bad investment really depends upon how much time you plan on having the investment mature. Incredibly important question. Hey, how patient are you here? You could look at some, like, say, for instance, right now in late 2016, early 2017, and say, hey, if I want to buy a property in one of the hotter Boston neighborhoods, let's just call it the Back Bay, and it's a smaller condo type of thing, 1 bedroom. If you want to flip it in the next 2 or 3 years, yeah, you're going to make some profit probably. But if you buy and hold over the long term, you're looking at a much different type of investment. So let's go on and clear this page here and take a look at some different types of value. All right, so let's talk about a couple of other approaches to value. Insurance value. Insurance value. So this is quite clearly if, heaven forbid, your house burns down or something, what do you still have? This would be an easy one, class. I hope you guys get this one. Obviously, you have the land. You still have the land. And insurance value is what they're willing to give you in order to rebuild the house. Rebuild the house. Should, heaven forbid, it burn down or something awful like that happened. The replacement value is what it's actually going to cost to rebuild the house. So hopefully you're insured enough up to or exceeding the replacement value. I just had this friendly chat with my own insurance company about a year ago. Again, it's what insurance value is, what they're willing to insure it for. And this one is, I'm sure I misspelled that. As you all know, class, I can't spell, so we'll just get rid of that one there. And replacement value is what it's going to actually cost you. And I know that you've all had incidences, maybe with your automobile, for instance, where the insurance company is going to give you, I don't know, $1,200, but it might cost actually $1,500 to get it replaced. So there's a discrepancy between these two things here. And of course, then you have to dig into your own pocket and come up with the cash. So this is what they're willing to insure it for, and that's actually what their cost is to actually replace it. The next one's subjective or use value. This is a very interesting one. It's what you get from having the property. So for instance, if you are in the red on the property, so you're underwater. Let's just draw a little water here just for kicks. This is you, and you're and the surface of the water is up here, so you're underwater. You still get to live in the house, and while the house may you bought the house for $500 and now it's worth $450, so the value has gone down. As long as you don't realize that profit and sell at this time, therefore you still are using the property on a daily basis, so you get a value in using it. It sometimes can also be effective if you built a house which was just on your own. You built it, and maybe you built it without a lender, and you just built a wildly ostentatious house because you wanted it, because you could afford it, and you may have exceeded the neighborhood values or something like that. That would be a subjective use of your funds. But I like this other example where, people are underwater in their property and they still get to use it. So I like that example better. Book value is going to be what the value of the property that's carried on your balance statement, on your financial statement. And of course, that's always going to be factored in how much it cost and minus your depreciation. So that's what book value is. So certainly an accounting type of terminology right there, book value. And don't forget the insurance and replacement value. So very important concepts of value, all of those that we just spoke about. How we get to these actual values has to do with the principles of value. So there are things that trained appraisers and people in the marketplace and real estate agents look at in terms of how we put values on property. And these are different ways that we would put values on property, or ways to look at value, I should say. But the principles of value obviously affect this. So let's take a look at some principles of value. There are several. Okay, so principles of value. First off, we have our good old friend supply and demand, right? Supply and demand, the good old graph where price meets hopefully in the middle right there, supply and demand. That one's easy, I hope, for you. And the next one, of course, is the highest and best use. This is why we don't see, say, like a parking lot in on the island of Manhattan in New York City, because it's not the highest and best use of the land. We see those if you have gone to Manhattan. They do have parking lots, obviously, in Manhattan. They have garages and whatnot, but we don't have a flat parking lot, just parking lots in Midtown Manhattan, because that's not the highest and best use of the land. The highest and best use is to build some type of office skyscraper type situation. So that's what we mean by the highest and best use. That's a principle of value. It kind of seems obvious, but there's a word for that. Economics professors put a phrase to that, and it's called highest and best use. The next one is conformity. When there's a expectation that things are going to stay the same, for instance. So this changes over time. We have neighborhoods, for instance, especially urban neighborhoods, tend to change a little bit quicker than others. But for instance, there's a district in downtown Boston called the Leather District. And it used to be a bunch of leather warehouses right near South Station, leather warehouses, wholesalers, dry goods, that type of thing. And nowadays it's all high-end office space and condos, So the things change, I guess, is the moral of the story in that regard. So conformity, whether things are actually going to stay the same, makes a big difference. So plottage, I like to kind of think about this as like when you on Monopoly, if you own what are they called on Monopoly? It's Park Place and that other blue one. What are those two? I can't remember. Oh, it's Boardwalk and Park Place, right? If you own Boardwalk and Park Place together, then you can charge more. Why? Well, I'm going to just actually draw this up here in the corner. If there's a parcel like this and it's owned by several different people, just kind of drawing the lots here, and you went along and over time you bought all those people up. So this is the parcel here. This is the parcel here, right? We're looking at it. And over time, if you went through a process by which you assembled them together, and you bought everyone out gradually, then you're going to obviously have assembled a larger singular piece of property together, and you have gotten a plottage value out of that. So think about it as Boardwalk and Park Place. Those are blue on the Monopoly board, if I remember correctly, and so that's a nice way to think about it. The principles of change. Things change, and when we think about change, sometimes you're going to come across a property that has passed its economic life. So maybe it was built as, for instance, factory housing, and now the factory is in another country, somewhere far away, and while the house itself still has a physical life left to it, its economic life may have peaked and may have even expired, and so that's a perfect example. A ghost town would be a perfect example of something that still exists. So the physically still exists, but the economic life of the ghost town has ended. That would be a good example. Thank you, Jack. Good job for thinking about that. And of course, we always coming along with that exact same concept when we think about the life cycle of properties. We have we start off here and we have growth, and then things usually stabilize, and then they start to decline, and then there's some type of revitalization. So there's your typical life cycle of any type of property, any type of economic activity. And of course, real estate is a type of economic activity in and of itself. So very important. We still have some more principles of value to discuss. So let's clear this page and write a few down and talk about just a few more. I love this section of the class. Okay, let's finish up principles of value. So the next principle of value is substitution, which this is kind of the definition is built right into it. Clearly, any property's value is going to tend to drift toward the value of a fairly comparable properties. So there's going to be only so much, not to get too mathematical on you, deviation from the mean. Your value of your home can't really deviate too far from what other similar properties are selling for, or what it could be substituted for. In other words, if you're going to buy I'm just looking around here, if you're going to buy a tea kettle, because I see a tea kettle across the room over there, then the price of that tea kettle isn't going to be too far from the price of, on average, what people are paying for similar type of tea kettles. So I don't know if I can draw a tea kettle. There it is. There it is. And it's got steam coming out. There we go. Sorry about that. Sorry you had to endure that tea kettle drawing, but there you go. All right, let's move on to contribution. Contribution, this is when you add something to the property. You're obviously going to be looking for a return on investment. ROI, a return on the investment. And so if you put in a new kitchen and baths are things that a lot of folks put into properties so that they can increase the property and get a return on investment, they're going to be looking for, of course, a profit out of that. No one puts a kitchen into a house and hoping to fix it up so they can sell it for less. No, they want to put the kitchen in there and sell it for more, because therefore the house is move-in ready. The new buyer doesn't want to do any work. They want to move in and have it ready on day one. There's a premium people will pay for that, and that premium is called the contribution. Okay, so, or the margin, the profit margin there is called the contribution. Now, there is this concept, of course, that you can put so much money into something that you can't sell it for this high price out here because you put too much money into it, and you can only sell it for something down here. This is the concept of diminishing return. So if you think about it like at a McDonald's, for instance, if we'll draw a little chart here to kind of give you an idea. At a McDonald's, as they add employees, so this would be staff over here, then they can sell more burgers, if this is burgers. Now, eventually, they're going to hit a point where even if they added an additional employee, they won't be able to sell any more burgers just because they only have so many burgers they can cook given the physical limitations of the kitchen, and therefore they're going to actually hit a point of diminishing return where it doesn't pay to add any more employees because you can't serve any more people, and therefore you've hit the point of diminishing return up here. That's a good example. So that's the good example of the point of diminishing return. Think of it like that. Always just think about that McDonald's example. And the example from real life in real estate is you never want to own the nicest house on the street. You never want to own the nicest house on the street, because if you own the nicest house on the street or the nicest house in town, then you might not be able to get your monies back from it. So if you add in gold, if you live in a normal neighborhood, whatever that happens to be, and you add in gold fixtures this and gold fixture that, and eventually you're going to be putting so much money into the real estate that you can't really justify that price when you sell it. So I think I hopefully made that point clear for you. And the last one is a very interesting one. That's called anticipation. So there is a principle of value that says that, hey, a property is worth, let's just say, $100,000 today, but in the future, something's coming along that's going to make that property worth much more. The classic example for this would be, hopefully you'll get that as I'm drawing it, these are railroad tracks. And the classic example of this is the streetcar suburb. The streetcar suburb is basically the way that lots of our urban areas were developed in the 1910s, 1920s. Like, for instance, if we're from a Boston reference point of view, Dorchester, Allston, Brighton. A lot of the Green Line is built in a streetcar suburb manner, because the land property owners actually they own the property. This is almost all farmland back then. They own the property out in Allston, Brighton, and so in order to get their increased value from it, what they did is they ran a streetcar out to it, so now you could commute fairly easily. Well, as long as you're on the Green Line in the wintertime, you could commute fairly easily to downtown Boston. And as a result, as they built the streetcar, the values went up along the streetcar line. The same thing is happening with some interesting impacts actually along the Green Line in Somerville and Cambridge, because the Green Line is supposed to extend from Lechmere out to Union Square and Tufts University, and that Green Line project is off again and on again, and it's $2 billion and it's $3 billion, and now it's right now in the late 2016, supposedly it is on for an additional 7 stations so that you can actually commute from various parts of Somerville. But we'll see whether or not that actually gets built. I know that along that Green Line corridor, people are already paying anticipation prices. Think of that old Carly Simon song, right? Anticipation. Yeah, sorry. But think of the old Carly Simon song. People are paying a higher value now for some type of benefit or service that would come in the future. So some other impacts, these are not necessarily principles of value per se, formally, but other things that impact the value of the property. And for the most part, these are things that we as real estate agents are going to be involved with all the time. These are the kind of subjective things that help you as a real estate agent put a finer point on what you think the market value of a property might be. And the number one is, of course, environmental stuff about the climate, the weather, the not only Mother Nature factors, but of course the physical environment, what's being built in the neighborhood. Oh, there's a new YMCA is being built, so that's going to be something that is going to be in the neighborhood, and so property values go up. YMCA. Or a new school is going to be built in the neighborhood, so the property value is going to be up. Everyone's going to be able to walk to school, where before, because this town didn't have enough schools, there was a 20-minute bus ride. Now the neighborhood is going to be served by a school and people can walk to it. So all those types of things. Social forces. Ooh, that's an interesting one. We'll talk more about that when it comes to fair housing. For sure, we'll talk more about social forces at that time. But social forces also are the natural, for the most part, migration of different groups of folks. So that happens sometimes even without the government encouraging it. So social forces between different groups of people. The overall economy, whether times are good or times are bad, so that also affects value. In government regulations, sometimes there's different government regulation out there relative to especially the mortgage market, how you can use a property. So also falling into this category is going to be zoning or the lack of zoning, that type of thing. Whether or not a property has recently been rezoned. So before it was a single family home and now it's a single family home plus business zone. So that could affect the value. So there's a wide range of topics that go into this other aspects that aren't necessarily economic principles of value, but certainly affect the values. The amenities in the area are another good. That's what I kind of wanted to drive home when I said environmental aspects. The amenities in the area. So When we finally get to the point that we have had a pretty good discussion of the economic principles of value, and I think we've done that so far, now we should go on and actually say, well, as real estate professionals, how are we going to go out and put a value on the property? And there's basically three methods to do that. And one is the market, or sometimes called the sales comparison approach. And the other one is called the cost approach, and then the other one is called the income approach. Let's put those on the board here for you, and we're going to take them one by one. So this is going to be methods to achieve value, or to estimate value, to get value. To estimate value, we'll say, okay. Be a little bit more professional, we'll say, to estimate value. And the number one way, of course, is going to be the market or sales comparison. Sales comparison. We're going to talk about that one at length. We're going to talk about all of these at length. The cost approach to value, and the income approach. So let's take each one of these one by one. So with the sales or comparison approach, or the market comparison approach, it really leans upon the economic principle of substitution, which basically means that you wouldn't buy, let's just make a car here. You wouldn't buy this car if it was the exact same, and it won't be because I can't draw, as you know. You wouldn't buy this car here if this was this many dollars and this was this many dollars, and pretty much the cars were the same. You would pick this car. Of course, you would pick, let's just change the color there so you can see. You'd pick this car, of course, because it's pretty much the same and it's less money. So you'd substitute this car for that car, and you'd buy that car there. So that makes pretty much sense. And the same thing works in houses. You would not buy this house if there was another house which was pretty much equal to it. And if this house was $2 signs and this was $1 sign, you'd buy this house if they were pretty much the same. So that's the concept of, or the principle of, substitution. And the market and sales comparison approach works on the same principle. And so with this principle, which is something actually that you're probably, if you're going to go into the single-family home or the comparative market analysis, single-family home or the condo market, you're probably going to be using this all the time. In fact, there's a tool built into the MLS to help you do that. There's a CMA tool built right into the MLS, or at least most of the MLS services out there that helps you compare properties. Because basically, what we're doing here is we're comparing recent sales, and that's the key part. You gotta compare stuff that's been sold, actual stuff that went on the market and sold. It's not good enough that the property went on the market and maybe expired or was withdrawn. Of course, if that was the case, if they were expired or withdrawn, then whatever the price that they had is not relevant to the market value or the market price, as we spoke about earlier, because a buyer did not enter the market and actually buy during the time the listing was active. And if it was priced low enough, obviously they would have bought. So if there was demand for it. So in this case here, the CMA tool, we're always looking for things that sell, things that have sold. Now, you will have some agents out there that will sprinkle in their CMA analysis things that are currently on the market, listings in the area. Sometimes there are people that use a little bit of art to this and less science. I prefer that my agents at my company, and I prefer that you learn it this way too, that you're focusing on solds, because that's what only matters. It doesn't matter if somebody else has their house on for $525 if they can't sell it for $525. So that's really important. Well, Susie Q down the street has her house, and her house was built by the same builder in the same year, and hers is on for $525. We should list ours at $525. Well, that's apples to apples. Just because she's trying to get $525 doesn't necessarily mean that it should sell for $525. Ooh, that sounds like a definition of market value, doesn't it, that we talked about earlier? So let's keep that in mind. We're going to be looking at sold properties. Now, when we get into a CMA using this approach, we have to always recognize that properties are inherently different. Real estate is inherently different. There's no two properties that are exactly alike. I guess that's not what I wanted. Didn't want to write a dollar sign there. I wanted to write actually with one property at 2 Maple Street, even if it was. There's another house at 4 Maple Street, and they were built on the exact same day by the exact same builder. They're still just a teeny bit different. They're unique. Remember, we talked about that later. They're going to be unique, and so each property is different. And consequently, when we use the sales comparison approach, it's not like we're buying staplers or flashlights or anything like that, or even laptop computers where when it comes off the assembly line, one stapler from whatever company makes the staplers is the same as the next one that comes off the assembly line. Real estate's not like that. Each one is a little bit different. So going into this sales comparison approach, we have to realize that there are differences even between very similar properties. Now, the tool that's built into the MLS is going to have some, what's the word I'm looking for? Ability for you, and by the way, there are aftermarket tools that your brokerage may or may not use, but for the most part, you're going to have a tool that's built into the MLS that comes with your MLS membership, should you be a member. Not every real estate professional is a member of the MLS or even needs to be. We'll talk about that later, perhaps. But nonetheless, most of you will have an MLS membership, and there's a tool in there that helps you find comparable properties. And I'm going to just draw a little diagram about how this is actually done. We're going to use a very simple, just to kind of drive home the point. So we have a subject property. We have a subject property, and when we have a subject property, we do try to spell subject right. There we go. Thank you. Sometimes when you're writing and talking at the same time, the pen doesn't always do what you want it to do. So we have a subject property, and I'm going to draw a line here. And let's just say that this subject property has 3 bedrooms, 2.5 bath, and a 2-car garage. So what we want to do is find out how much are we going to sell this thing for, right? So what's the sales price going to be? So let's use some comparables. I'm going to draw a little line here. We're going to find another house in the neighborhood that recently sold. We're going to call that comparable number 1. We're going to find another one that's recently sold called comparable number 2. We're going to find another one that recently sold called comparable number 1. Now, all of these have 3 bedrooms, and there are a lot of different factors that drive price, but the bedroom count most certainly is a big factor. The comparable number 1 also has 2.5 baths and also has a 2-car garage. So we know, because it just sold last month in this theoretical example, that it sold for $400,000. Okay, well, we should stop there then, of course, because that's the answer, right? No, it's too small of a sample size, and it's not enough for us to justify pricing the subject property at $400,000, or at least setting our target at $400,000. The reason I mention that, of course, because if we want to get $400,000 in some markets, you have to actually mark it up to mark it down. Some markets you list it for 400 and you're going to get 400. Other markets you list it for 420 and you'll get 400. So keep that in mind. Some people like to think they're going to get a little bit of a break, even if you knew you were willing to drop it down to 400, even though you listed it for 4.25 or something like that. So there's a lot of strategy that goes along there. We'll talk about that later, maybe. House number 2 was a 3-bedroom house, but it only had 2 baths. By the way, why don't you just write over here? This is beds, and this is baths. And this is cars, garage doors, garage capacity. And it also had 2-car garage. Great. So it's almost a match, except we're missing a bathroom here. Now, we're going to say that this house sold for $385. Now, we know, based upon our experience as a real estate agent, that and in this market, that people really like a half bath, off the kitchen in your normal 2-bedroom colonial. So let's call that bathroom that we're missing here about a $20,000 value. So we're going to call it a $20,000 value. Consequently, if we can squeeze that in there, this house, apples to apples, should have sold. Do we add or subtract the $20,000? I'm wondering. I'm going to pause here a little quick second to actually wonder if anybody knows. We're going to add the $20,000. That's exactly right. So apples to apples, this house sold for $405. Can we stop there? No, we still have to go to our third comparable, and sometimes you may have more than 3 comparables. Let's say that this also had 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, and a 3-car garage. Ooh, a big garage. All right. So, and we also, not for nothing, but we have to also assume that all the other things that are equal in this process, for this very, very, very simplified example that we have here, they're all built at the same time. They're all in the same school district. They're all in the same condition, all that other stuff. You're going to be looking at that. And, from a CMA point of view, you do have the tool that pumps out this data from the MLS, but in essence, I think it's best from an educated point of view. I think there's a lot of information. There's a lot of, I'm more of an analytical person, but I am a big believer in knowing your market. And the simple fact of the matter is you're going to know if this price that we come up with here is right by the math, but you're also going to know it if you're out there actually seeing houses on a regular basis. So in this particular property here, this sold for $440, and now we have to look at how much that garage was worth. Well, a garage is worth, we're just going to say, class, that a garage is worth $30,000. So what do we do here? Well, because they came with an extra garage, we're actually going to subtract that value. So apples to apples, that's $410. And then to get our value that we want over here, we're just going to take 400, 405, and 410, add them all up, and divide by 3. Well, I'm no math genius, but even I can do that in my head. That's 405, isn't it? Yes, it is. So here's your very basic CMA, we call it, comparative market analysis. And, I just want to take a quick detour here and just remind you that this 405 number that we just came up with, there we go over here, we'll write it over there. In most markets, we can talk about this at length too. In most market, there's a discount of value going on here between the 405 number and the number that you actually want to list it at. So I'm active in the Plymouth marketplace, and I know that sellers usually get 96% of list price, 96% of list price. So having said that, if I could actually do a little math, I have a calculator right over here. We'll pop it up real quick. There we go. So I'd go 405. That's what I think I should get for the house. If I just divide that by 0.96, that should get my listing price. There it is right there. For my listing price, I think we had 421 up there. We'll just bring that calculator back up real quick. 421 and change. 422 we'll call it. Should I list it for 422 or something like that? Well, I'd probably list it for 424.9 or something like that. I'd also talk with the sellers and who in the end of the day, of course, are the final arbiter of what it's going to sell, what it should list for. It's their decision based upon your recommendation, but in the end, it's their decision. Depends upon how eager they are to sell. Listing this for 409.9 is probably going to move this property quicker than if we list it for 424. So it really depends upon how motivated they are to sell, and that's something that you're going to have to discuss with your client and see, hey, do they want to really move on, or are they just kind of testing the waters a little bit, and they're a little bit more patient, I guess. So there's your sales comparison approach. Let's go on to the income approach and then the cost approach. So using the income approach, we look at this approach for places that generate income, like shopping plazas, rental property, that type of thing. And in this area, we're going to look at value as an expression of the, I know this is probably going to throw you for a loop, the present value of the future rental income. Okay, so, oh gosh, I can already tell you're a little bit wound up about this one. Yes, and there is a formula. There is a formula I'm sure that you're very excited to learn. And I think this is one of the very few formulas that you should actually memorize for the exam. Value equals net income. Value equals net income divided by the cap rate. Value equals net income divided by the cap rate. In other words, value is a derivative of the net income. So let's take a look at how we're going to actually do this math and some of the things that we should keep in mind before we actually dive in and do the math. First off, when we're looking at net income, you want to make sure that you always are going from a net income point of view. Before you get net income, you also have to factor in whether there's going to be some type of income that you can't collect. If you can't collect it because of a vacancy, for instance, then there's going to be what we call a factor of effective gross income. So if you, for instance, take your apartment building and just take the number of units and multiply it by the number of months, you'll say, okay, if we're got a 10-unit apartment building and every apartment rents for $1,000 a month, and of course times 12, that would be $10,000. Okay, that's a pretty easy one to do, right? Except for the fact if we're running a 10% vacancy rate, oopsie, that's a problem. This number here is going to be lower, obviously, right? That's not that hard to figure out. And obviously, if we're running a 10% vacancy rate, then we have to take 10% of our revenue away. Let's see, 0, 0, 0. Okay, here, carry the 1, 8, 0, 108. That was easy for you folks, just helping you out there. So our effective gross income in this particular example here is going to be 108, because even though what we want to collect is 120, what effectively we can collect is only 108, because on average we run a 10% vacancy rate. So in these particular examples, I think we also have to be very careful of what we understand to be an expense. And expenses fall into two categories as a general rule. One is going to be a operating expense, and the other one is going to be a capital expense. So for the exam and for real life, you definitely want to know the difference between one and the other. For instance, if we were going to be buying and improving the building with a new heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system, that's a capital expense. The electrical the electric bill to run the heating and ventilation system, that's an operating expense. Just like to plow the driveway is operating. To pave a new one is a capital expense. Pave new driveway. All right, just so that you have a pretty good idea. And, with these math questions on the exam, just a little pro tip here for you. Occasionally what they'll do is they'll sneak in something, or not, I shouldn't say sneak, that's not the right word. They'll give you more information than you need. And part of the intellectual proof that you know what you're doing as a real estate agent is to make sure that you get a lot of information. You know what to ignore, what is not part of the calculation. That knowing what's not part of the calculation is just as important as knowing what's is in the calculation. So in this particular example, you definitely need to know for the net operating income, you got to know what expenses to include in that. Things that you capitalize over years, long-term expenses, like your mortgage, for instance, going to be in the capital expenditure. So let's go back to the formula that we just mentioned. I'm going to write it down here for you again. Value equals the, what do we have here? Net income divided by the cap rate. There we go. All right. Oh, good gosh, Jack. What does this mean? All right. Well, it's not as hard as you might say. Let's just take an easy one here, okay? So let's just say we have a value of $500,000. We don't know what our net income is, so we're going to call that X. And we have a cap rate of 10%. All right, now what do we do now? Well, this goes back to our old math procedure. We want to get X by itself, right? So I'm going to divide this side by 10%. 10% goes into 10% how many times? That's right, one time. So that leaves X. So over on this side, we have X times 1. X times 1 is also known as X, right? So we've accomplished the good old task of getting X by itself on one side of the equation. So I know for some of you this is fairly easy and you've already done the math. This is kind of the long way. That's okay. Let's just do it that way for everyone. So over here we have to divide 500,000 divided by 10. We're going to get 50,000 of net income. So that's our net income. That's our net income. Very, very easy. So on an annual basis, we're making $50,000 in net income. We're going to divide that by the cap rate, and that's going to get our value. So that was so easy. I know you can do it on the exam. I know that you're not going to get tricked up by the difference between operating expenses and income, capital expenses. And you definitely should memorize this one. I like to actually abbreviate this as NOI, net operating income. It's a little bit easier to write. Value equals the net operating income divided by the cap rate. All right, let's go on and talk about the cost approach. So before we actually do that, I just want to mention, of course, that we're going to use that CMA approach that we talked to when we have things that we can compare. When the subject property has other things out there that have been sold that are very similar to it. We're going to use the the income approach when there's rental property, there's some type of income that the property derives. And we're going to use the cost approach. Basically, it's the approach of last resort, When there are no comparables and the property doesn't make any income, then what do? You use the cost approach. So let's go take a look at that. So in using the cost approach, there is another formula for you to learn for this one. Sorry about that. This is probably, I think there's probably just these two that you probably should memorize for the exam. Value, there might be others, but these are the two that jump out. Value equals the price of the land plus the improvements minus depreciation. And I guess we should put a finer print on it. This is the estimated cost of the land or value of the land, and the estimated cost of the improvements. Oftentimes you're going to find this out from doing a CMA, and also from the improvements point of view, usually you're going to be talking about replacement cost. So in order to build a new fire station or something like that, you're not going to build an exact replica of the existing fire station from 83 years ago, because that would be called reproduction cost, and you don't want to reproduce it. You want to build, obviously, if you're building a fire station, up to the new standards. So this, by the way, says reproduction, and this says replacement. So in most of these examples, you're going to look at the value of the land via a CMA, and then you're going to be looking at a replacement cost to replace the asset that is there. And almost always that's a building. We call it improvements, but usually a building. And then you're going to subtract depreciation. This is probably a good little time to talk about depreciation. In a minute or two, we'll also talk about appreciation as well. But basically, when we talk about depreciation, we're talking about the dividing the cost of the improvement, over its life, over its lifetime. So very, very simple, or its useful lifetime might be a more precise way to say it, but dividing its cost over its lifetime, so that since it's such a big ticket item, unlike a pen or something, I suppose you could depreciate a pen if the IRS wanted you to or allowed you to, but we're talking more like a big ticket item, like a refrigeration system for a restaurant. A roof is a perfect type of big ticket item that you'll depreciate over time. So here's your cost approach to value. Fairly straightforward. Remember, the value equals the estimated value of the land plus the estimated replacement cost, in most cases, of the improvements, and then you subtract depreciation. So fairly straightforward. And since we're talking about depreciation, let's talk for a minute or two about appreciation and understanding the two of those things. And those concepts are also tied directly with another important economic concept called obsolescence. So let's talk about those items right now. So with depreciation, obviously that means your value is going down for any reason, and appreciation is when your value is going up for any reason. And any particular property over time, usually there's like a tug of war between these two types of things, where you can have an older property go down for a little while, go down in appreciation, and then get reappreciated later on. We see this actually in cities today. Very often people are flocking back to cities, unlike ever before, or at least in the modern memory. So the values go up, the values go down for a lot of different reasons. And even though if you have an older house, it could be worth more than when you first bought it because of appreciation, not the least of which, of course, is inflation and that type of thing. But, we don't usually see that in automobiles. Usually when you buy an automobile, just to kind of give you a compare, contrast, you've obviously heard when you drive it off the lot, you've lost so much value, because an automobile, for the most part, unless you have some type of classic, Mustang or Corvette or some type of collectible automobile, for the most part, it is a depreciating capital asset. It's not something that appreciates unless it's some type of collectible. So, real estate, hopefully, if you do real estate right, you buy low and then it appreciates over time and you sell high. That's the name of the game, of course. So these are kind of the warring factions between value, depreciation, and appreciation, which gets to an important discussion of their cousins, really, and their cousin to that is going to be obsolescence. So obsolescence. So that's a tough one. Let's spell that right for you. So the cousin of appreciation and depreciation is obsolescence, and the functional obsolescence and external obsolescence are the two different types that you should be aware of. Functionally obsolete, you've probably heard that phrase, of course. That means it's lost some value, usually due to some type of changing standards in the marketplace. And I think the best type of example that I like to teach, at least, is let's see if you folks recognize what this is at all. All right, and it's got a little bit of there we go. Oh, that wasn't too good. I'll try to do better, but let's see if I can draw that better for you. There we go. Let's try to draw that better. It's a door. It has a little window in at the top here. Anyone knows what this is here? Anyone? This is an outhouse. This is an outhouse. And once upon a time, this was state of the art. And then came along indoor plumbing, and to have a one-bathroom house was state of the art. And so nobody wanted a house with an outhouse anymore. And while it still worked, of course, it was functionally obsolete. And so you actually see these houses, for instance, you see a lot of them in Quincy and Melrose that are Dutch colonials, and they have one bathroom at the top of the stairs on the second floor. And when they were built in 1925 or whatever, they were state-of-the-art houses with indoor plumbing. And this was all the rage. Of course, if you bought a house new in 1925 and you were, say, 40 years old, you probably very well remember a time when everything was outdoor plumbing. So having a one-bathroom house was awesome. Nowadays, of course, a lot of those one-bathroom Dutch colonials, somehow they've snuck in a half bath to the first floor, and so now they're a bath and a half. And, you know those bath and a halves, those half baths on a Dutch colonial. They're stuck under the stairs, or somehow they're carved out of a kitchen. And remember, my sister-in-law had a house with a bathroom. It was so small you couldn't change your mind in it, and you couldn't even wash your hands. They had no sink in the bathroom. It was tiny off the bathroom, off the kitchen. But they wanted to, the time came where having that extra half bath was so important that the newfangled Dutch colonial with one bath then again became functionally obsolete. So everything's always advancing theoretically, and nowadays, of course, with a 3-bedroom home, we're looking for 2.5 baths for the most part. And for the most part, from a consumer society point of view, we're always looking for more. And this is a kind of a great way to think about it. Now, external obsolescence is things that happen outside of your particular property. You may have a property that you keep up nice with your white picket fence and your little plants, and you've put on a new roof, and you keep the grass cut beautiful. You all know these neighborhoods where you see a couple of houses that are still kept up really nice, and unfortunately the vast majority of the neighborhood isn't. That house is going to suffer from external obsolescence. And of course, they're also pushing up against the point of diminishing return, because if they keep on keeping their property nice, even though they're getting value out of its value in use, they might not get a return on that investment when they finally sell it. So this is a sad story. These people that took care of their property, they actually get punished because it's in the wrong location. So these are very important questions for real life and economic concepts on the exam. Obsolescence. Some things can be functionally obsolescent. That doesn't mean it doesn't work. The good old outhouse, it still works. And the house that is the nicest house in the street, or at least the well-cared-for house in the street that fits in, it still works, but everything else around it isn't as nice. So because things change, neighborhoods increase, and they become then they stabilize, and then over time, with different migratory patterns or whatever, they become less important neighborhoods, and actually they might decline. So everything comes and goes. It happens in real estate, it happens in fashion, and this is the words that we use to describe these types of phenomena. So let's take a look at a quick example of how you are supposed to be using, or I guess that's not the phrase I want to say. What I want to say is we should probably be professionally aware of how we use a CMA versus when we use an appraisal. As a general rule of thumb, the CMA approach is going to be used by you, the real estate agent, to help clients put a price tag on their home. That's basically how it works. And of course, this is a service that you're usually going to provide for free because you're hoping to provide that information in the hopes that they'll give you the listing, of course. So it's a tool that you're going to spend some time with and then present to your potential client to say, hey, we're sitting down at the kitchen table. I did this CMA for you as a courtesy so that we could get an idea of what your house might be valued at. So you're going to do it to help clients, and you're almost always going to draw this information from the MLS. Now, there are, as we mentioned earlier, I prefer to stick to solds, but some people also look at on-market listings or expired listings as well. Not me. I stick with solds, but there are people that do this as well. So licensed appraiser, however, is an appraisal, and sometimes these numbers come out different because you may have done a CMA when you listed the property, and then, of course, you have a buyer that comes along and they make an offer, and the offer is backed by a lender who's helping them buy the property. And then the appraisal comes along, and the appraisal is way lower than the agreed upon price. In this case, you might say, well, I have my CMA. Well, that doesn't really matter because the lender is only going to listen to the value that is put on it by the licensed appraiser. So it's nice that you have your CMA, but the licensed appraiser trumps that. Oh, did I just say trumps? Sorry. The licensed appraiser supersedes that when it comes to who the lender listens to. And by the way, licensed appraisers also pull data from the MLS and other sources, but MLS is one of the sources where they pull information from. So this has been, for the most part, a great discussion about value. And let's go back to the live webinar talk. Remember, I'm always here, even when you are watching the video. I'm always here to take your questions. My name is Jack Gately. If I'm not here on the webinar, then the live and some other live instructor is, but it's almost always me. My name's Jack Gately. I'm the owner of Jack Gately Real Estate and the Real Estate School. Thanks for watching.